Hey everyone, this is the Black Manga Critic here with another video for Manga Monday. Now basically this is going to be a video on why you should read Dr. Stone. And this is another weekly Shonen Jump manga, right? So you're going to expect certain things when it comes to weekly Shonen Jump manga. But I particularly like this one. If I didn't, I probably wouldn't, make a video on why you shouldn't read it or whatever. So basically this is going to be a video on why you should read Dr. Stone. Also, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you're a new subscriber, hit that notification bell button. Find me and follow me on Twitter, and like the page on Facebook. So basically, this is a spoiler-free video. That means that basically, I'm not going to spoil plot points or mention character names that will spoil your reading pleasure or anything like that. So don't worry about it. But what I do want to go into are, just a bit about why I think the characters work for this manga, why the story is particularly interesting, and how sort of the world and art sort of work together to create something that's very engrossing, entertaining, and enthralling. So basically, just to get into the story quickly, what we do know from chapter really, basically, is that the world was pretty normal. Everyone was going about their lives. The characters are going about their lives. And then this phenomenon happens where this bright and shining light turns every living thing into stone. Right? So, Dr. Stone, that title is kind of like a play on the fact that, the world has been turned to stone and something else, but I'll get into that when I sort of talk about characterization and stuff like a bit. So, what's really important to know about this story, generally, is that this is sort of about how the characters are going to survive in this sort of new stone world, because at this, when the characters, really sort of get into the story and the plot and things like that, millennia have passed. So basically, that you're going to learn that in the first chapter. So it's not necessarily like a spoiler. It's not something that's like, oh, it's going to kill your viewing pleasure. Now we know that, millennia have passed and blah, blah, blah. No. That's just basic information that you sort of have to know and when you're thinking about whether you want to read this manga or not. So if we're talking about the story, after that particular plot point, right, in the first chapter, this is what I think really draws readers in and really wants to make people like, me want to read this manga, for the long haul. Because I think one thing that this type of sort of setting does, right, this environment where let's say certain characters aren't, stone or whatever, right, and they sort of wake up in this world, right. One thing that I think really helps is the fact that we have to sort of think about as readers, we get to sort of see how these characters are dealing with particular moral questions, right? How they sort of decide, what do we, do first? Do we try to set up civilization and then try to figure out how to get everyone else out of stone? Or do we, figure out how to get everyone out of the stone, encasing first, and then try to set up civilization? And things like that. And there are questions like that throughout these chapters. And they really sort of make you think about, what would I do if I was in this situation as a character, in this particular story or whatever? Could I make these particular, grandiose, moral decisions and, sort of live with myself if I chose one path or the other path? And I think, questions like those really make you want to read the manga. They really want to make you follow these characters and see how they develop morally in this different setting, right? Because in the setting where they're just, in 2016 or 2017 or whatever, right? They're just chilling. You know what I mean? They're just doing their thing. Maybe they deal with other types of moral, morally ambiguous questions and things like that. But in this world, things become very, in some ways, even more difficult, right? In some ways, things become very simple because you have to have particular objectives. But in another way, those objectives, really come with their own sort of moral questions. So yes, you always say okay, I can either do this thing or that thing, definitely. But with those two things come particular moral questions that really make the characters interesting and things like that. So to get into the characters, I think one thing that this manga does very well is that it sort of balances how the world influences these what I believe to be very generic characters, right, in certain ways. So, right, if you think about something like a Hunter x Hunter, right, you have these generic characters that are introduced, Gon, Leorio, Kurapika, and Killua, right, and even Hisoka to an extent, right, and you have these characters that are introduced, and the world continuously forces them to make decisions that are, that are morally ambiguous, that have consequences, right? Physical, mental, psychological consequences. And I think that Dr. Stone is something that also tries to sort of play with that, tries to make the world sort of a character in of itself, right? The world is always sort of around. You never really forget that the characters are in the particular world. So when you are reading Dr. Stone, you really get the sense that like the two main sort of protagonists, Taiju, who's just very like, sort of, I want to say maybe like generic shonen, sort of like male protagonist, and Senku, who's a little different in his sort of like love of science and things like that. But these characters continue to have to make morally ambiguous decisions that really come at odds with their own particular like sets of dogma. Like Senku, aka Dr. Stone, has a very sort of scientific way of thinking about things, but this world continues to force him to make particular decisions that would go against his own sort of morals. And the same thing for Taiju, right? Like these characters have to, one, they have to survive, right? Two, they have to sort of bring back civilization. Three, they have to, save all these people that are still, encased in stone. And so all of those things, right, and other characters that are also introduced, force them to make particular decisions that I think are really interesting to read and to watch, and and it's very interesting to see how the plot develops and how narratives develop based on the interaction between the sort of the world as a character and the actual characters as characters. I think if you're going to read Dr. Stone for any character, you're going to read Dr. Stone for Senku. Now, Senku was basically like, this huge science nerd who like loves all things, right? Like clearly loves all things science, is very much so obsessed with it, clearly a genius, things like that. So you're really invested in watching not only sort of necessarily his growth as a character, but like I said, particularly how he comes about making particular decisions, right? So maybe, he has to make a decision that seems simple at first, but is actually very sort of like, complex in like sort of like in its consequence, right? In the fact that like if he makes a particular decision, a scientific decision, he has to think about how, coming about this particular bit of information will affect the world, will affect other characters and their actions and things like that. And I think that he really, holds the story together clearly because one, he really is the like protagonist. He's the titular protagonist, and you're very interested in watching him not only sort of grow as someone who is genuinely in love with science and sort of the way that the world progressed throughout like millennia, right? But as someone who is clearly invested in, trying to sort of understand how he can make scientific decisions while also sort of maintaining his own moral sort of codes. So I think that if we're going to continue to talk about the world, we really have to talk about why the art is very much so compelling. I think there are scenes where, like, when you see those sprawling like panels, right? Those long multiple page panels, you're like, man, this is amazing. But when sometimes you'll see these single panels, and you'll see like just like a tree that's beautifully drawn, or things like that that has to that's related to the narrative or something like that, or a particular like science sort of ideal or things like that that Senku's sort of thinking about. That's also just like drawn in a way that you wouldn't really sort of like think about. I guess like sort of an example is like when Senku's sort of trying to figure out how to sort of advance sort of civilization in a certain way, like the art sort of picks up in a sense like in his sort of character drawing and things like that nature, and I think it just works very well. So I think when you're reading this manga, like you always want to look out for how the art accentuates not only sort of like the characters and sort of like the environment, but sort of like how particular things, like how civilization is being moved forward by Senku in a sense. Because like the way that's drawn is also like really, really striking. And I think it's another thing that keeps you invested in the manga. You want to continue to see sometimes splash panels, sometimes single panels, sometimes character models, things like that. So, the art is generally really nice. In terms of sort of the character designs, like, they're very distinct. Like, you remember who Senku is. You remember how he looks. You remember certain other characters and how they look. And I think that, you want that in a manga. You want characters to be memorable. Otherwise, the manga is not particularly good. So I think that, the manga does a great job. The mangakas do a great job of doing that, of making sure that the world is very distinct, memorable, The character design, the art is very memorable. The character designs are very memorable. And, you know, it's just another reason why you should read Dr. Stone. So yeah, that's pretty much my review in terms of like Dr. Stone as a series. I think that it's great. Remember, this is spoiler free, so I didn't want to get into anything very, very particular. But I think that you should read it. I really love reading it every week. I'm going to start doing reviews for it on Weekly Shonen Jump Thursdays, because I just wanted to really sort of get into a space where, like, you know, I had reviewed Dr. Stone as a series up until this point, so that one, I can make this video, but two, like, when I go into other videos about Dr. Stone, like, you know, everything is very much so fresh in my mind. So when I am doing the reviews, you know, all y'all know that, like, hey, like, I remember stuff, like, I know about certain things, and we can have discussions, like, in very in-depth discussions based on, like, you know, where the world is going and things of that nature. So yeah, you know, this is basically a great, great manga. Read it, binge it, you know, do all the stuff that, you know, you're going to do with it, and then come back to this channel and, you know, watch my reviews of Dr. Stone and have discussions and do all that great stuff. So, I'm the Black Manga Critic with a review of Dr. Stone and, you know, why you should read Dr. Stone, and I'm out.